Yes. ايش شرطية؟ ايش؟ ايش شرطية ساكس تورزيلية بلغوا فيروس
No, okay. هم؟ في الايه هي مش راجعة ما اعتقدش. حضرتك مش رايح المركز؟
لا مش هروح. نحاول بس
Hello. Hi, excuse me. Can you please make sure that the minister speaks at fourth or fifth?
Okay. All right. Sounds good, right? Yeah. Okay. So then, okay, now. Volume. Ready? Okay. Yana bir bora assalomu alaykum. Men ismim Umid Umidxo'jayev. Men makroiqtisodiy prognozlashtirish va tadqiqotlar instituti direktoriman. Hozirda mana kambag'allik forumi bo'yicha suhbatlashyapmiz, lekin bugun bu sessiyada yashil iqtisodiyot haqida gaplashamiz. Rahmat. I see. Thank you. Good. So, for the beginning, I would like to give floor to Jane Olga-Ebinger, Secretary Leader on Sustainable Development at Central Asia Office, World Bank. Please. For the beginning, I would like to give floor to Jane Olga-Ebinger, Secretary Leader on Sustainable Development.
Hello, can you hear me?
World Bank. Please.
Yeah. Shall I go ahead? Yeah. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. From the World Bank side, we have had very good news this week with the board approval of a new country partnership framework for Uzbekistan for the next 5 years. That's 2022 to 2026. This new country partnership framework builds upon our engagement in the past 5 years that puts substantial emphasis on institutional and capacity support, on reforms alongside investments, with a third of those investments going to some of the poorer regions of Uzbekistan and helping to contribute to a reduction in poverty from 32 to 25% over 2016 to 2019. So this new framework for our work together will help accelerate the transition to a sustainable and inclusive market economy, and achieves the government's goals of halving poverty reduction by 2026 and achieving upper middle income status by 2030. And to do this, we're prioritizing work to increase private sector employment and to build human capacity, two things that we heard in the plenary this morning. But one major shift we're making focus on improving livelihoods and increasing resilience through green growth. So the question is, why did we make this shift?
Bo'ldi, hal bo'ldim. Gazmingiz.
We're good to go. So, what I was saying is, why have we made this big shift? So, traditionally, historically, there's been a dependence on natural resources extraction and manufacturing, but these resources have been used inefficiently, and that has led to a series of environmental impacts. So, for example, today, Uzbekistan is the 5th most GHG emission-intensive country globally. Land degradation, sand and dust storms have contributed, for example, to 4% loss in GDP in 2016. And we see that mortality rates due to air pollution are twice those of the EU. We also see that the use of water and energy is unsustainable. And in the agriculture sector, for example, 90% of the renewable water resources being used. One of the big challenges going forward is that we expect climate change to significantly increase the intensity and the frequency of floods and droughts and landslides, and this could have major economic impacts as well. So we're already seeing an average of 1.4 million people a year affected by floods, and with costs to the economy of around $3 billion. So this is why it's really critical to make the shift towards a sustainable, green and inclusive economy. And we're very pleased to see that the government of Uzbekistan has prioritized green growth in its national development strategy, in the strategy for climate change and the green growth strategy. This has prioritized a range of things, such as increasing the share of renewables in power generation by 2030, expanding the area under drip irrigation, tackling environmental challenges like the Aral Sea. But, on the World Bank side, what we're aiming to do is to support Uzbekistan in this transition through our new country partnership framework. And we're intending to do that in two ways. So the first way is to provide support for the policy foundation that is needed for green growth and to achieve the 6 priorities for the green transition that the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction has identified. We are working very closely with other development partners, many on this panel, to provide inputs to the strategic framework for green growth, to work on a long-term strategy for climate change, and we're also working on a disaster risk financing strategy. At the World Bank, we'll be initiating work on a country climate and development report, which will look at how we can manage the impacts of climate change on development priorities and identify actions for the next 5 years to tackle those. And we'll also be focused on reforms through a development policy operation, which could, for example, look at how to incentivize industry and consumers to reduce emissions and increase their resilience. On the investment side, we are prioritizing actions that grow the market for renewable energy, that tackle emissions and energy intensity in the industrial sector through energy savings. We will be working on more sustainable agribusiness practices to save energy and water. And we will also be focusing on landscapes, particularly in the border areas where there are poorer communities, so that we can tackle those economic challenges and help to increase more sustainable jobs for men and women in those areas. On the climate front, what we will be focusing on is a strategy on the finance side, a disaster risk financing strategy. We'll be continuing to work on strengthening weather and climate services, and we'll also look at resilient cities. So this is a large package of work. It's going to be a long journey, which we are very pleased to be accompanying the government with to make this transition. And it's going to require being able to be responsive to a range of questions that are on top of everyone's mind. So these are questions around, how do you identify those green jobs? How do you adapt to climate change? What are the specific things we can put in place and how we can attract investment? So we're there, we're ready to bring international expertise and experience to the table and to work alongside yourself and other development partners. So maybe what I could do is hand over to my colleague if he's online, because we've just completing a stock take on economic growth, and they've been looking at issues around carbon pricing, and we thought it might be useful to make a couple of remarks about that.
Please, Weijen, if you're online, we're
Yes.
waiting for your intervention.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello. Yes.
Ovoz bilan bog'liq muammo bo'lishi kerak. Sound.
Can you hear me? Hello.
Just a moment. Yep, I think we can hear you.
Okay, can I proceed now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, and happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Just carrying on from where Jane left off, she mentioned an extensive package of various kinds of support to address different needs as Uzbekistan tackles green growth challenges. On my part, I've been part of studying areas related to the green growth opportunities and challenges, and this is part of supporting the policy foundation of green growth that Jane mentioned. So in terms of the carbon price, we looked at this as one of the possible instruments or strategies for addressing the high GHG intensity and therefore the need to decarbonize the economy. What we found that is indeed carbon price can be quite an effective tool for reducing emissions. It's already currently practiced in about 64 jurisdictions around the world, including both national and subnational governments. Carbon price can be done different ways. A straightforward way might be to have a carbon tax based on the carbon content of a fuel, and that's administered upstream at fuel production or supply. Another way could be to effectively set up a emissions trading system and capping those emissions, and the regulators can use the amount of emissions to effectively set a price and control the emissions that way. So how effective is this strategy? We found, yes, it is fairly effective for emissions reduction. There's been estimates done by the IMF and the World Bank using a carbon pricing assessment tool. Using some scenarios, they calculated that by 2030, a carbon price of a nominal amount that would, say, increase the price of electricity effectively by around 12%, would be able to reduce GHG emissions by around 11%, compared to a case where there's no carbon price. So those estimates tell us that the carbon price does work in terms of as an emissions reduction tool, but there are, of course, other benefits. Enacting a price on carbon would generate fiscal revenue, and that potential was estimated to be actually quite substantial, up to about 5 to 6% of GDP in additional revenue to the state for 2030. Of course, by cutting back on carbon emissions, you do derive other co-benefits. You'll have an improvement in air quality through reduced emissions of other kinds like particulate matter. So the public health benefit is another advantage of a carbon price. Of course, the carbon price isn't the only thing that you can do. A price on carbon would only work if firms and households have a reason to consume less energy that's carbon intensive, or to choose a lower carbon form of generating electricity. So in order for that to work effectively, you'd also have to look at the way energy is priced currently, and to unravel some subsidies that might be present. In the case of Uzbekistan, there could be some implicit subsidies to energy price, so you'd have to look carefully at perhaps rationalizing that before you even consider introducing an effective carbon price on top of that. So one thing to bear in mind is that energy costs are generally a higher share of total expenses for a low-income household than it is for higher income households. So raising the price of energy services will effectively impact low-income households a little bit more than higher-income households. To understand exactly how much and which of these households will be more impacted, it's strongly advised that we conduct a quite detailed distributional analysis to understand which households are most affected. The World Bank is currently doing this right now in conjunction with block tariff increases that are being considered. So this would be important in terms of shedding light on distributional implications. Of course, when you have a carbon tax, this additional revenue can come in pretty handy, and most countries have used this to offset any competitiveness issues with trade-sensitive sectors, trade-exposed sectors. But since we're on a subject of distributional implications, clearly carbon revenue can also be used to enhance any existing social safety nets to support low-income households as we move towards the low-carbon transition. So those are generally the initial findings from this study. This is just one part of a broader piece of work where we are analyzing different green growth challenges and opportunities as part of the support for the Policy Foundation. Thank you. I'll pause here.
Thank you very much, Vijay. Thank you very much, Jane. Especially, we all know that it is about economic growth, but just like in a economic theory, we have competitive equilibrium and then social optimum. So you want to have maximum growth, but at the same time, you want to be beneficial in terms of welfare. And similarly here, we can identify those sectors which give us the maximum growth. And then we can also identify those sectors which give us minimum CO2. And then when they overlap, this is the green path. This is where we not compromise our goals of reducing poverty, economic growth, and having good climate for the future. Thank you very much. And next, I would like to give floor to Ambassador Adrian, EU Ambassador to Uzbekistan. And we know that in EU, the attention to climate change, attention to green economy started much earlier. And you've been also listening to our plenary session. So what is your take on the green economy transition in Uzbekistan and in the context of fighting poverty? Because some people view green economy as a costly, because the technology become costly, trade become costly. For example, when we talk about carbon border adjustment mechanism, when you trade and it's becoming costly. But at the same time, there is some benefits to it. And I think it's worth also mentioning this part as well. So what is your view on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me for this panel, because I'm probably, the only one not really being an expert in green, in the green economy. But in fact, I'm more an expert, in fact, in terms of poverty alleviation. This is what I've been doing for the last 30 years. And it's only recently that I've become ambassador to Uzbekistan, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity, because I also think this is really important, because it is also the importance of the political part is extremely important. Now, from the EU side, yes, it's true. We've been working on a green transition for years, and I think this is not only, we've been working on it also because we also see that it is, as you said, beneficial also even for poverty alleviation. And we definitely believe that poverty reduction and climate change are not rivalry policies. Adapting and to climate change doesn't necessarily, we've seen it before, doesn't necessarily, and it doesn't in this case, in fact, contradict each other. And this is really, I think, important also for us here to integrate that from now on. We've seen, I think we all agree that we've all seen, I hope, we've read the IPCC report, when was it, a month ago? Even if we have a crisis, another crisis ongoing, the IPCC report is there. We may not have talked a lot about it, but we know that this is part of our future. And therefore, in fact, from our side, it's really important that we also accompany the countries that we work with in terms of making sure that we do decouple, in fact, the economic growth from the environmental degradation. And this is something that we've been doing for a long time, and we will continue to do it. And we do it when there is a commitment. And we see, this is the good thing about Uzbekistan, because we do see that there is a strong commitment to do this. And there's a strong commitment to go towards a green transition. I'm very happy to hear that the Economic Forum in September, will be focusing on green transition and SME development. And I hope that the SME development will also be focusing on green SME development, because this is also what we've seen in Europe. In Europe, 98% of our jobs are created by SMEs. And that's, we heard from our colleague from Georgia, their poverty alleviation went through jobs, jobs, and jobs. And this is also, in fact, in Europe, this is also, I mean, in fact, I'm not saying poverty alleviation, but this is also what we do. It's jobs. And we're now transforming them with our Green Deal into green jobs. I mean, hopefully most of them will become bit by bit green, and this is really important. And we believe that we really have also in Uzbekistan an opportunity now to go along and definitely create, there are good opportunities to create green and sustainable jobs for the future. So the first point, my first point is really this: going towards a green transition is important. What we see with the government in Uzbekistan is that, in fact, we've heard it also this morning, there was a call for coordination. We've just heard from the World Bank. We're working with the World Bank. You will hear from IFD. We're working with IFD. We're working with UNDP. We're working, in fact, with everybody. But it's also true that we can do more. And we've seen lately that there has been platforms are being set up, and I think this is really important. But maybe from our side, what I've seen for the last year is maybe that what we also need is, in fact, a coordination and an interministerial coordination within the government. And when I say this, this is not only, because green transition is not only about economy. It's also, as also was mentioned this morning, one of the biggest sectors in Uzbekistan is agriculture. So we need to have, in fact, all interministerial. We see there is a willing to do, but we need now also need to see the implementation. Of course, the Agency for Ecology, but everybody should be involved. And this is this holistic view, holistic approach to the, let's say, the transition towards a green economy is really key for making this a success. And we're definitely from the EU side, we're very happy to also contribute, participate, but definitely we need also not to compete. ODA is not something that will grow. And as was mentioned also this morning, we need to get the private sector on board, and that's really important. And we're also trying to do this. We need to gather, in fact, as was mentioned, have one channel, like I think Rolly was saying it, one channel, make sure that there's a policy which is a whole of government policy, and then we can, in fact, support much better, both at the policy level, but definitely also in terms of implementation. My third point is what we're doing, in fact, for the EU. And it's true, we've been working on, let's say, on green agriculture or agriculture and trying to make it more green for quite a while. In Uzbekistan, our new multi-annual indicative program for the next 7 years is all green. It's about governance, and this is also really important that the governance is part of it, because otherwise nothing, in fact, works. It's about green transition, supporting the government, green budgeting, green taxation, but also the conventions, the green conventions, which will be coming up and which will be necessary for GSP+. So this is where working with the Ministry of Economy is important, working with the Ministry of Trade, and them working together is key also for making this transition a reality. We will be working also with other partners, but we definitely need to have this coordination. Now, we're also going to be working on green agriculture, smart, eco-friendly agriculture. And this is, again, this is not only about agriculture. This is also about trade. This is about food security. This is about what people eat. And more, this is also why green transition is also, there's no question about the variability. Because in the end, the sandstorms, we've seen it in some countries that people are going to hospitals. This is very costly. The food that they eat, if it's not green, and I'm not all of it green, but if it's not healthy, people end up with cancer. People end up with, so we really need to do, in fact, the transition. And this is what our multi-annual indicative program is about. Now, a third point, what I wanted to, in fact, say also in comparison, or what was not said, I would say this morning, was that for this to be a reality, I think there's something which we see, which is maybe a bit missing, not in the government, because the president is saying it, because it's going down, it's in the sustainable development strategy, but maybe in terms of also everyone, making sure that we're all, the awareness is there, but also that all people are participating in this green transition. And this is maybe where civil society, we have some civil societies that are working on environment, not many. And this is maybe something where the dialogue and the awareness raising also with the civil society is really important for us. This is what has made it a success in Europe. What it is, I used to, 20 years ago, work in something which was called Eurocities, which was an association of cities in Europe, 30 years ago, in fact, now. What they did was make something which was called Agenda 21, greening the cities. We see it in Europe now. This has become, in fact, come up from, in fact, the cities. The cities have become green, people can cycle, the trams are there, and we're very happy to see that this is also an idea that bring back public transport, which is green and effective, efficient. And then make sure that this can also go up, so that you have both, in fact, from the top, but also from the people are aware. Young people need to be involved much more. They are the ones that will make the transition. So the reforms will not happen tomorrow. We're all eager for them to be implemented tomorrow. We're all eager, as Mr. Pushkarov said it. He has a new idea and it would be nice to have it implemented tomorrow. It's not possible because this is for people, but this is also by people. And the fact that it's by people means that people have to change their mentality. In Europe, it took generations. It took one generation minimum. And we know it. The World Bank made a report 10 years ago, if I remember well, which was saying a real reform to have its real benefit, it takes a generation, it takes 15 years. So this is also something that we need to take into account. This needs to be accompanied. It needs to be, and we are here to accompany, but it's something that also will take some time. And we need to also give it time, not change all the time. Make sure that everybody is aware, make sure that everybody's working together. And then there's definitely, we're also definitely eager to do this with our partners, with our, in fact, European Investment Bank, which is also now gone green, with EBRD, with IFD, and this is why we're also working together as a Team Europe also with our member states, 27 member states, we're now also teaming up to do it green. And I think if we can all do it green with all of you today and tomorrow, then it's probably a possibility for a reality. So with this, I'd like to thank you. And we're looking forward to accompany and to go for this. I'm not going to call it a revolution, but definitely it needs to be a green transition. And we're looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting points, especially the coordination and the point about dissemination. Yes, it's a bottom-up approach, because usually we can have laws, we can have new regulations where we enforce them and we're compliance. You go factory by factory looking at what technologies they use, but at the end of the day, it can also be influenced by the choice of the consumers as well, with they are aware, and they dictate to the private sector business in which directions to go. That this really can contribute to meaningful and long-term change. Thank you very much. And but it's also about financing. Yeah, we understand we had solar panels in space in 60s or 70s, but to bring them to the roof of our houses, it has to do with finance, so the affordability as well. So in this sense, I would like to ask our next speaker, Suren Pogosyan. He's SDG Finance Advisor at UNDP. Thank you very much for joining us. What is the financing aspect of it, especially related with SDG aspect, and what kind of linkage it has to the poverty reduction efforts? Thank you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Abitajev. dear distinguished panel members, it's a great honor, dear colleagues, it's a great honor to be here and to present the topic. Actually, I have prepared slides, and if it is possible to put it on the screen and the clicker. And while this is being prepared, I actually like very much Sabina's perspective on the team game, team play, and I'll accept the ball. I'll try to speak about the specific aspects, and this is only a fraction of what UNDP does, but specific aspects on the financing of SDGs and in the context of green and sustainable development, but also in the context of addressing the poverty reduction in the country. So, can I have the clicker?
Clicker. Okay, we can just mention the next one and they will just...
Okay, so next slide. Yes, thank you. So there will be a couple of points, maybe a little bit provocative or maybe some myths that I would like to discuss today. And they will be about financing aspects of these type of strategies. And on the slide, you can see the 7 targets of the SDG 1. And I want to bring only to the attention of the 2 lowest ones. I will not be reading. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So I would like your attention to put on the bold parts of the sentences at 1.A and 1.B, like about significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources. This is critical to understand this. We're not talking about public funds. We're not talking about state budgets. We're talking about number of players who will need to play in a team game to address the challenges. And the second one is to support accelerated investment in poverty eradication action. So we need to engage the private sector. We need to engage investments into this field. And we also heard in the morning about this topic. Next slide, please. So one of the sort of myths, common perceptions about the finance is that there is always a lack of money. I would like to present a different view that the challenge on financing the green and sustainable development is not about money. It's about how we use the money. Fossil fuel subsidies have increased to 6 trillion annually last year. Since Paris, commercial banks invested $3.8 trillion into fossil fuels. So there is a lot of money that goes against, or at least as for our French colleague labeled in their budgeting system, brown investments, not green, but brown investments. And in overall, there are more than $400 trillion in global finance. We need only 1% of that amount to match the financing gap for achieving SDGs. So it's not about the lack of money. It's about how we approach to the money. Next slide, please. And the other sort of misperception is that we live in the 21st century of information. But we see, especially in this financing topic, we see so many cases of different players being lost in translation, different players talking different languages. Like we currently have the draft poverty reduction strategy, very comprehensive, super interesting, super well structured, 7 strategic objectives, 50 priority measures, and 152 sub-measures. I have spent 25 years in public finance management. I will not speak on behalf of all PFM experts, but I've worked in ministries of finance. This is hardly the language they can translate into budget decision-making. So we need to help. What UNDP is trying to help countries in this region and globally is to build this connection between planning people and financing or budgeting people to connect this translation, to address this translation issue. And the point is that it's not only how we translate this into the financing decision, but also do all financing actors like private banks, private sector, do they speak the language that this strategy is written? That even if they understand this language, even if they perform the actions, will the feedback mechanism speak the same language? So there are technical issues, not political, not policy, but technical issues that we also need to address. And I'm happy to present a couple of cases how in UNDP we approach to this challenge. So the universal challenge on this translation between planning and financing, you need to address in possibly two ways. One is you either invest a lot in having an excellent interpreter who can sit in the middle of the process and try to connect the two languages, or you find the common words that both planning and financing people understand. And that's the second approach is the Sdg language. So this is the Sdg language that bring into the governments, to the other actors, and we try to formulate this bridge between the different actors. So tools like budgeting for SDGs, green climate budgeting, tax for SDGs, debt for SDGs, SDG bonds, green bonds, these are the toolkit. This is the toolkit that addresses this language issue at the technical level to cover a variety of different development finance aspects that UNDP is promoting across the globe. Next slide, please. So this is final slide. Actually, the whole presentation is about this slide. The other ones were just to warm up and cook the presentation. So the first sort of individual tool, I will speak about some individual tools in the beginning, and then I'll try to sum it up into more systemic solutions. So the first one, things like conducting green public expenditure review in Uzbekistan is the way how we can reveal the information about what is happening in the country, in the economy, in relation to the green finance, climate finance. And this is not an easy task. Unlike many other sectors, unlike many other topics that are important for any country, including Uzbekistan, green or climate sometimes is so much cross-cutting all the different sectors that there is no there's neither an institutional system that will bring and collect all this information, nor the information base. So you need to spend an additional effort to reveal that information. So this is why the green public expenditure review is important. Unlike education sector or health, where the systems are already in place to present that information. So this is the first, but very important tool to bring the information up. Second is introducing Greenland SDG budget tracking. I remember the times more than 10 years ago when UNDP started working on climate finance, and climate budget tracking was the entry point in our cooperation with ministers of finance in those countries who more than 10 years ago already faced the problems of climate change. In Asian countries, there was a huge flooding, huge climate change related aspects that ministers of finance themselves were inviting UNDP to talk to them and help them in creating and revealing this information. So the climate budget tagging, green budget tagging are actually where our entry points to also then expand the cooperation with ministers of finance to cover a wider range of SDG topics. And jumping a little bit ahead of the topic, or ahead of the bullet points, coming up with these individual tools helps also to create the tool, the systemic tool. The same tool, the same approach can be used for gender budgeting. You can use it for poverty reduction related, because poverty reduction is also cross-country. We heard about multidimensional nature of the poverty reduction. So you need to create this technical toolkit that can reveal and then ideally help in budget decision-making and investment decision-making. Next one is analyzing the effectiveness of tax policies in the context of SDGs. We sometimes spend a lot of efforts on the expenditure part of the budget, of the public finance, but we forget sometimes the revenue part. I was happy to hear our colleague Vejen, with whom we have cooperated on a coalition of finance ministers for climate action a long time ago. So the topic about carbon taxation. But there are also other types of taxes that you can bring in to address the poverty reduction in a sustainable and gender reflective way, responsive manner. We know that some of the types of taxes are regressive in their nature, by definition, almost like VAT. Some of the other taxes are progressive. So you can play with the balancing between the different taxes, not only the rates, but also how you actually use specific aspects of tax policy, like tax expenditures, tax incentives. In this region, it's not uncommon for governments to introduce so many tax incentives, which some of them are dated more than a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago. But there is no system to regularly address the effectiveness of these tax expenditures. We have countries in this region that have 4, 5, 6, and even 8% of GDP as a foregone revenue. So this is a huge amount. Imagine you bring in the information about these tax expenditures in the same classification as your budget, SDG budget tagging key is talking about. Then you will be able to compile both information flows, clicking one button, and the government decision makers, Minister of Economy, Minister of Finance, all other key players will be able to see what is the relevant balance between expenditure part of the government intervention or tax expenditure, which is foregone revenue. The government decides to leave a lot of money in the economy, in the households, through these tax expenditures. But do we know what is the effectiveness? What is the linkage with SDGs? What is the linkage to green agenda? What is the linkage to the gender agenda? So tools like mapping of the tax expenditures with SDGs or aligning them is an ideal thing to bring in all this information into one common language. This is the language that policy people will understand and finance people will understand. And imagine, this is quite applicable, we believe, for Uzbekistan today. But imagine in the next phases when we bring in the private sector and private banks or public banks that operate in Uzbekistan using exactly the same classification. So you generate even more information using the single classification system. You understand how much is spent on this particular poverty reduction target by different actors. That will allow not only to see the picture, but also for finance ministry to rebalance, reprioritize the budget expenditures to the sectors, to the topics, to the targets that are not properly financed by the private sector, which is not uncommon. In Turkey, for example, there was a SDG investment mapping done with two interesting dimensions. They not only revealed the important economic sectors from the SDG perspective and prioritized them, but also they came up with a list of the same sectors, but in order of how much private investors are going into these sectors. And there was a significant mismatch, which means government has a role to fill that gap. The next one is mobilizing resources for green and sustainable development investments through SDG and green bonds. Again, Uzbekistan is second country in the world to issue SDG bonds, and UNDP had its own important role in helping the government in this journey. But also we can now talk about green bonds. And a bit later, I will also talk about interconnectedness between these tools. So we want all these topics to be interconnected. And then other development innovative financing mechanisms that connect poverty and gender dimensions, for example, afforestation. So in that sector, you can talk about innovative financing mechanisms that can, again, try to address multidimensional aspects of the poverty. But most importantly, I would like to end the presentation with the last bullet point, which is about connecting the dots between all these tools. For example, in the green bonds, UNDP was helping Indonesia 5-6 years ago to issue to issue green bonds. First, actually, Islamic green sukuks in the world. But many people maybe in this room also know about this, but I suspect few of you know that UNDP helped to create a climate budget tagging before these bonds have been issued. And the important topic and the importance of this is that investors already could see how government is creating a system by which they can monitor and track the proceeds from the bonds into sectors, into the projects that are green or climate relevant. So you need to create one tool that will help to actually effectively use the other tool. This is this slide is about this interconnectedness of these different things. I talked about tax policies and how they can be connected with expenditure policies. I talked about investor mapping, private sector investments, how they can be connected. So we all frame all these topics into the not only UNDP, the development community frames it into the topic, in the term which is called integrated national financing frameworks. We are, again, taking from Sabina's point, we are part of the big team who plays the football using different actors, with EU, who is supporting globally the INFF, with different bilateral actors, with World Bank, with IMF, with Asian Development Bank, with all IFT, with many, many actors. Sorry if I'm not naming all of them, but this is really a team play. And with this, I would like to stop my presentation and pass the ball to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So main takeaways is these funds, it's not about what, but how to use them, I understand. So you mean about systematization, crystallization, yes, to see the cause and effects and then in real time and provide this kind of toolkit for the government. That's a good point. And about integrating. Thank you very much, Suren. And then we have many institutions. I think there is no serious international organization which issues some flagship report without taking into account the climate change, all kind of investment we have like kind of second line saying it's a climate adjusted investment amounts and everything. But we have institutions which are really, as Ambassador Adrian mentioned, committed, yes, to this cause from the beginning. And this is we have a representative of Global Green Growth Institute, Aaron Russell, today with us. Please, Aaron, your take on the issue and what GI doing in Uzbekistan, please.
If I could have the presentation on the screen.
What slide now?
So I'll just preface my comments here that while some of you apologize for not being environmentalists, you're more poverty reduction and economists. I must apologize in the reverse. My background is very much on environmental management, on natural resource management, and climate change adaptation. And so the perspective you will get from me is much more on the project implementation end of things, which I believe is very complementary to the comments provided to you. And I would like to provide a little bit of a perspective in terms of the global green growth efforts in Asia, more globally, as it gives an insight into the types of tools and analyses that we provide, and then how these are reflected in our activities in Uzbekistan with some overarching conclusions. Next slide, please. Just as an introduction, some of you may not be familiar with the Global Green Growth Institute. We're a member-based intergovernmental organization that is headquartered in Seoul in Korea. Our mandate is to support through embedded technical assistance in host country governments, the development of a low carbon resilient world of strong, inclusive and sustainable growth. We do that in three general thematic areas: sustainable energy, which incorporates renewable energy and energy efficiency types of interventions; green cities, the range of e-mobility, waste management, urban planning, construction types of interventions that are needed to transform from business as usual into green city development; and then sustainable landscapes, where we look at climate smart agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and coastal resources management. The priority that I will emphasize here in this presentation is our work focused on the sustainable landscapes, as that is the first priority that the government of Uzbekistan has set for us to support them in the green rehabilitation of the RLC region. We do work through policy, financing, and capacity building interventions. Next slide, please. I will not read all of these slides. They're illustrative more than anything, and there is a reference for those who may be interested. However, just to highlight that poverty eradication and gender equality, gender and social equality are cross-cutting priorities for GGI across all of our activities. And in the way that we implement, in particular, sustainable landscapes types of projects, we see a critical intersection of supporting both the natural capital outcomes, the sustainability of the natural resource, and the economic benefits to be derived from the development of those value chains, which we would see under our GOP3, our Global Operational Procedure number 3. But at the same time supporting the policy context and to enable the investment to take place. Without the enabling frameworks, the investments will not follow. And we believe in trying to develop support for governments that incorporates all three of these components. Next slide, please. This is a very simple heuristical model based essentially on our strategic outcomes. And we try to, we will not accept this idea of a trade-off between natural capital or sustainability and poverty reduction or economic growth. The types of interventions that we aim to support are ones where we find ways that we can demonstrate our impacts both in terms of reduced GHG emissions, supplying ecosystem services, so in terms of the sustainability of land resources, of forests, of water resources, the creation of green jobs, not any job, only green jobs, and the enhancement of adaptive capacity. Please, next slide. a very large framework through which GGI provides its support is through climate action, adaptation and greenhouse gas mitigation actions that are generally within the context of the nationally determined contributions. We provide support in a number of different countries on this. In Uzbekistan, the primary one, this slide preceded our intervention in Uzbekistan as we are relatively new office. However, our primary intervention in Uzbekistan is to support sectoral policy and strategy development for the RLC region, and I will describe those in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. We also provide a range of financing, innovative financing services. These include providing financing support for bankable projects, i.e. supporting governments that have identified projects that are critical to their achievement of their NDC goals and supporting them in mobilizing finance for them. We also support the development of finance facilities that can provide sector-wide financing through private sector commercial banks. And there are a range of different tools that we use. And we also do have a growing thematic area around the development of thematic bonds. Thematic bonds include SDG bonds, sustainability bonds, and green bonds. This is just an image of several countries where we're currently working on it, and we're very excited with the prospects of developing an RLC green bond with the government of Uzbekistan in the coming months. Next slide, please. Overall, GGI has mobilized over $2 billion in green investment over the previous 5-year period, of which a large proportion is on projects that are focused on sustainable landscapes. So that incorporates the climate resilient agriculture, forestry, and coastal resources, mangroves. So this is a really a very large area of work for us, in particular, providing the integrated solutions for policy and investment mobilization. Next slide, please. So, zooming in on Asia specifically, GGI currently has 15 member countries within Asia. Uzbekistan was the first country to become a member of the Global Green Growth Institute in 2019. Since in Central Asia, Mongolia did precede Uzbekistan in that regard. We've had recent joiners of Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, and we're actively discussing the partnership with Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. We have supported a large range of policies to be implemented and mobilization. We have a large number of partners that fund this work. Next slide, please. One key element that I will highlight in our next strategy of the next 5 years, we've highlighted the critical cross-cutting issues for Asia are really our focus on green growth for rural areas that incorporate climate change adaptation, natural capital, supporting natural capital, as well as poverty reduction and gender inequality. So these are cross-cutting in all of our work. And we have a number of key partners that enable us to develop the pipeline of bankable projects to support member countries. Next slide, please. I will not provide, this is illustrative for your information. If you're interested to learn more, you can contact us, but we are implementing a $5.9 million project funded by the Korean government, specifically for promoting the green rehabilitation of the RLC. This is through with a number of existing partners, and we are signing partnerships with the Multi-Partner Trust Fund for Saving RLC of the United Nations, the GIZ, and the IFAD Interstate Commission for Sustainable Development, and many other partners to enhance our implementation of this. Next slide. The overall objectives of this are to support strategy development. We produce a number of analyses with it in this context, and we're now supporting the development of a new RLC 5-year strategy and potential green bond pipeline development. As the colleagues have discussed, behavior change is critical for the behavior change and capacity building is critical to achieve these changes for beneficiaries. So we're doing a large-scale awareness raising campaign targeted specifically at youth, at women, at men at different scales of agricultural production. We will be mobilizing $20 million in green investment through the piloting of climate resilient technologies, specifically greenhouses, drip irrigation, and agroforestry, through resource efficient processing practices for those value chains, and through the development of online business platform to provide enabling framework to gain access for farmers and processors and commercial interests alike. And then finally, we will support the scaling up of these interventions through development of a credit guarantee facility to allow agricultural MSMEs to gain greater access to financing through sustainable agribusiness. I think we're moving to my last slide. Next slide, please. So these are just some overarching conclusions as I observe the elements of success and challenges that we have faced in our current project. The critical element is that we have to, the green growth solutions require solutions that both reduce vulnerability and inequality and promote innovation and green sector growth. It cannot only be a reactive one that tries to reduce the harms of climate change. It also needs to create an optimistic spirit and enable the private sector investment to grow. And these require integrated solutions. Policy, technical, financing interventions need to be well integrated, requires strong coordination among development partners and among government institutions. These are a number of points that I identified as areas of to be noted, but I would say actually the most important one is the partnerships that are needed to achieve these. GGI, just as any other organization, we cannot hope to achieve all of these objectives without strong partnerships, and we're actively seeking additional partners to scale up our impact within Pakistan, other regions in Uzbekistan and in the region, to scale them up as well as to enhance their effectiveness. So look forward to learning from other partners. We're already discussing with some of the partners on this panel areas of how we could support the scaling up of their interventions and vice versa. And I look forward to learning from others in the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Taking into account our time constraints, so I will want to give the floor to our next speaker. Indeed, you mentioned about the change in the behavior of the individuals as well. And when the government announced that we want to reduce poverty twice in the next 5 years, working on 3 directions: it's education, it's social security, and entrepreneurship. Once we're talking about entrepreneurship, it's a business, it's a corporate sector, and that transformation needs to be happened there as well. And in the recent decree by the president was announced new measures about the further enhancement of the role of the private sector. And there were mentioned about the kind of specific task for state-owned enterprise as well, to look at the ESG reports and to learn how to actually, how could I say, to have some sort of accountability, because this is which will be required in the nearest future. And in this sense, I would like to give the floor to Anwar Nasruddinov, the principal manager at EBRD. So what is your take, and how do you relate green transition to the corporate sector and in the context of poverty reduction, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here on this panel and represent EBRD. As you know, EBRD is active in the private sector, and that's our mandate. And one of our key strategies is becoming at least 50% green bank by 2025. So we put a lot of efforts in financing the private sector in terms of reaching the green goals. And maybe I can start off with the interactions and of the climate change and the climate response with the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know that from the reports of the IPCC that limiting the global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial levels will make it much easier to achieve some of the aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, those related to poverty, hunger, water and sanitation, cities and ecosystems. So that means that if we're limiting the global warming, we are reducing the number of people who are exposed to the climate risks. And we're also limiting people who will experience food shortages and water insecurities and economic losses. So from that sense, we would like to focus much on how we want to achieve this, the goals of the Paris Agreement and achieving the net zero by 2050. And what will be the role of the corporate sector in that sense. And one of the aspects of achieving net zero is to look at the future trends. And we know that the energy demand will grow, and much of that growth will come from developing countries and the emerging markets. And on top of that, there is this extreme weather patterns that are happening due to climate change. The extreme cold and hot summer temperatures will driving the demand for cooling and heating. So we want to focus on how we can reduce this negative impact on people by mobilizing the corporate sector. And that means we need to reduce energy demand, which is, we've seen in the past several years that energy efficiency gains are much slower than in other areas. We need to decarbonize electricity, and we need also other fuels, and we need to also see a lot of electrification of the end use energy, and we need to reduce agricultural and industrial emissions. What are the sectors that we see a lot of potential in achieving these goals? One of them is industrial sector, and another one is mining, and the third one is agribusiness sector, where we can see the huge potential. So these sectors will require a lot of large sums of investments into low carbon technologies and practices, but also they'll require a mind shift, the shift of behaviors, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. So in terms of the industry, we know that these sectors like iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and aluminum, they globally use up about 69% of the global energy demand, and they also emit about 74% of global CO2 emissions. In terms of the agribusiness, it accounts for about 30% of energy use, and they're responsible for about 20% of the greenhouse gases. And we all know that the population growth and income growth will drive the demand for the food. And how are we going to meet these challenges? So we need to leverage these global agribusiness corporations that have a power to introduce the changes along the value chains, because they have this purchasing power from various suppliers. The same thing is happening in the mining sector. On one hand, mining is a huge energy consumer, but on the other hand, it brings a lot of metals and minerals that are required to support the transition to low carbon pathway, to the resilient economy, to the climate change. And these are, when we talk about battery electric vehicles or battery storage, to scale up the renewables, we're talking about copper, lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So these are along this also for wind energy or infrastructure that is required. We need a lot of steel. So the mining sector has a potential to minimize the climate and environmental and the social footprint through this value chain, the raw materials value chain. So how the corporate sector will have to play its role? It's very critical that the mitigation goals are reflected in the corporate sector strategies. We know that at the national level, we see the climate change strategies, the policies are being put in place, but the corporate sector or sector-specific pathways, sector-specific roadmaps are required in order to introduce the changes in the management, changes in how the corporate people taking the decisions in their boardroom, and they're introducing the technologies and facilitating the investments. At the same time, as we know that the impact of climate change is becoming more visible, the financial sector is also reacting to this. So institutions, financial institutions and corporations are coming up with their own methods of assessing the climate risks within their sectors, and they are bringing this risk assessments into a decision-making process at the strategic level. And we see from the TCFD reports that the investor requests for climate-related disclosures are becoming a key drivers for companies to publicly provide climate-related information and show that they're transitioning to low-carbon technologies, to low-carbon pathways. But these are happening only in the advanced economies at the moment. And financial regulators at the same time also requiring greater transparency, and they want to understand and also respond to the potential climate risks in the financial markets. So as we see, the public awareness is raising, the demand for low carbon products and services is increasing, and the way how they operate throughout the value chain is changing. So what is the theory that that of change needs to take place, including in Uzbekistan, is first we talked about technologies. We need technologies, and they only bring so much change into greenhouse gas reduction and limiting the global warming. But the second one is the behavioral change, and it was mentioned already by previous speakers. And the behavioral change is the change about corporate governance and the corporate climate governance, where the climate targets and governance principles incorporated into decision-making process. And we want to work in that direction increasingly. And while we do that, we want to address a number of financial barriers. One of them is that there is a limited volume of commercial funding available from commercial banks that can understand the low carbon technologies, how they perform and how they will be behaving, and the long-term tenor that requires to deploy this technology. So we need to bring in long-term funding. The second one is that there is a barrier related to early adoption of technologies. So early movers face this higher cost associated with developing feasibility studies, market assessment, energy audits, and plus on top of that, the lack of understanding of the topic also drives the costs up. And also in the commercial banking, we don't have, or we have very limited instruments that are linked to sustainabilities. For example, we know in European markets, sustainability-linked loans or performance-based lending is very popular nowadays, and borrowers here they are not incentivized to bring in these behavioral changes through interest rate reductions, for example, pre-agreed benchmarks that can be achieved. And based on that, getting the interest rate discounts based on their achievements. So these are the barriers that we want to address and work with the corporate sector and in these three directions that I mentioned, and make the long-term funding available and help our country to achieve their goals on sustainable development and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. Now I would like to give the floor to Vincent Copen, Head of Central Asia's Office at AFD. Maybe you can elaborate about the program and projects you're doing in Uzbekistan, and especially related with the budget support and its implications on poverty reduction in Uzbekistan. Thank you.
Many thanks, Umid, and many thanks to the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction for organizing this important conference and to have decided to organize it in Bukhara. Because first, we are very happy to be here in this historic city. But as well, I think that when we talk about poverty reduction, it's very important to talk about it not from the capital, but being near people that are concerned by it. So it's, I think it's a great idea. Maybe before talking about AFD, what we do with the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction, I would like to build up on the question of coordination, because I think this is a sport that is easy to claim for, but very difficult to practice in reality. And we usually claim for it on Thursday and Friday during conferences. And on Monday, when we go back all to our office, we go back to our bad habits. I think poverty reduction and green and sustainable development, these are two different public policies, but they have many spillovers. And if we don't take care of these spillovers, then we get into trouble. And for that, I just want to share a French experience, where in fact we had it wrong on that. So France, we try to be a front runner in terms of green, and we spend as well a lot of money in social influence, which means that we have very low poverty rates. Still, in 2018, when we decided to increase carbon tax, which made a lot of sense in terms of green policy, in fact, we did not work well enough before to realize that this would create a lot of problems for a specific portion of the population, who are the rural poor, and in fact that they need their car to travel to their job and to travel to go to the shops. And this part of the population, in fact, they got really angry because they had the feeling that the policy was completely unfair. And in fact, what happened is that you had a demonstration for months. The government had to backtrack. And in fact, it jeopardized the green policy for several months, in fact. So this is just to remind us that we need to look at it carefully before putting a policy in place. And so let me then try to comment on the how. I think first there is in Uzbekistan a great opportunity to do smart, which is that you have something rather unusual in terms of international standards, is that in fact the ministry that is in charge of poverty reduction, in fact, it's the same as the one that is in charge of green economy. And this is really unusual. This probably makes coordination easier on these two policies. So I would encourage to build on that. I would as well maybe we should. It has already been said, but again, it's not easy to do. We should try to have a green policy as much as possible labor intensive. And I would say when we look at energy, this is very difficult, in fact, to have green energy policy labor intensive. In fact, because solar farms, wind farms, this is labor intensive, capital intensive activity and not labor. And it's you can think about it. It's very difficult to find ways to avoid that, except if you succeed to develop biomass, where in fact it's more labor intensive. But which means that on other policies for green, let's say specifically, I think agriculture, this is really important to look at being labor intensive. We need each time as well to look at any decision that is taken on green to look at the vulnerable part of the population, just to be sure that they are not going to be in a big trouble according to the policies that is put in place. And last thing, and I would stop on this, is that in fact we should listen to what poor households has to say, because in fact often we learn from it. Myself, to share a personal experience, when I graduated from university, I went to first to work in Africa, in the Sahel region, and when discussing with poor households and poor farmers, in fact, I discovered that I was surprised that they were not trying to maximize their production. So I asked them I asked questions, and then I got the answer that what they were trying to do is to minimize the risk of starvation, which in fact as well makes a lot of sense. So this means that ourselves in the administration, in the financial institution, we need to be aware, not to think that we know and that the others, they don't know, and we should listen. So on the French Development Agency side, we are very happy for the close collaboration that we have been able to put in place with the team of the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction, but as well with other donors. I think on green, we have been able to do something that usually we are not as good as coordination, and with the World Bank, with UNDP, with the European Union, GGGI, we are having a lot of discussion together and able to work jointly with the government of Uzbekistan, and I wish that we can continue this way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Actually, I would like to thank all speakers today. I think we touched upon our country partnership framework, which is the biggest news of the week, and its main areas where we can concentrate on. We've talked about that there is need for behavioral change, especially from the consumer side as well, and it's a long-term project, yes, but at the same time, we need to understand that we need to walk the talk, so we need to also focus on the actions as well. We've talked about the financing aspect of it, that it shouldn't be kind of a blind carpet bombing type of financing, but we need to have a clear interlinkages about, just like with these PCs, where you push a button and you can see in the screen what's happening, yeah? And we've talked about the importance of pilot projects. Aaron mentioned a few, and I do believe that the medium is a message. When we actually see solar power, how could I say, plants, solar panels and water boiling stations to the schools and at the hospitals, there is some change will happen. People can ontologically actually see that the green economy is not something abstract, but something practical thing. We've talked about the change in the corporate sector, yes, and how it is related with economic growth, especially you mentioned the global value chains, and we know that the 2/3 of the world trade goes through global value chains, and we want to tap in when you need to understand that it needs to be green, at least from now on. And thank you very much for reminding us about Vincent, rhetoric and the reality of our commitments. Yes, so we need to talk a lot, but at the same time, we need to remind of of our commitments every day at each step and each second. And taking into account our time constraints, I would like to thank once again all the speakers and the audience, and I would like to invite you all to lunch where we can have a P2p Q&A session, okay? So it's going to be person to person. Great, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.